So I don't know. I'm sorry. I listen to me. I am speechless with what we just saw on at this emergency meeting of the not emergency this urgent meeting of the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. And it was called yesterday about midday, and it happened at 1 o'clock today. And I'm going to try and unpack that a little bit for you. But I will say, I have just been sitting since it finished in a chair in this hotel room, trying to process why I am just so shell shocked. Because nothing that we heard was a surprise in a way. But I think for me, and I think I'm still processing it, the confirmation that our country not only put somebody like that in charge of, as one person keeps saying, the nuclear codes, but that so many people were willing to accept his behavior and not talk about it in order to advance their grip on power is is to me an indictment not only of Donald Trump, but of this entire moment in American politics. So I'm still thinking about that, and I do have some ideas about that. But let me say a couple of things. First of all, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a historian. I don't speak for my employer when I do these things. And normally I take questions, but I am not going to take questions today because I actually had something I wanted to say to you all today because I didn't, when I was thinking about this week, expect there to be this hearing today, and I have some thoughts about where we are and perhaps what we can do to get out of where we are. So anyway, let me start with what we learned today. Yesterday, as I say, midday, the chair and vice chair of the January 6th committee announced that they were going to hold an urgent meeting today at 1 o'clock. And they didn't say originally who the witness or where the testimony was going to come from. But by last night, about midnight, we knew that it was going to be Cassidy Hutchinson, who was the woman who testified today. She's either 25 or 26 years old. I've seen it both ways. I will say, and this is not a historical observation, but a personal one, she appears to have the same sort of mind I did at that age, which was essentially a photographic memory. I no longer have that. But you could tell she was a very convincing witness because she didn't try to make herself more important than she was. She was very good about saying, I wasn't there, I don't know that, but this is what I do remember. And her recall of specifics was extremely good. And she was in the Trump White House, a special aide to the president and also the chief aide to President Trump's, I believe, well, I shouldn't say which chief of staff. I think it was the fourth chief of staff, Mark Meadows. Mark Meadows was one of the founders of what's known as the Freedom Caucus. And the Freedom Caucus are all those right wing, really far right Congress critters in the House of Representatives who refuse really to work even with the rest of the Republicans. They tend to be extraordinarily religious and seem to believe that the current system needs to be overturned. So Mark Meadows was a congressman from North Carolina, and as I say, one of the original founders of the Freedom Caucus, and became Trump's chief of staff. And Cassidy Hutchinson worked for him. And in the process of working for him, she did a number of things. She was in charge of keeping the scheduling. She was in charge of coordinating with the people in charge of security for people in the White House. And she also was very, very close. The White House is actually pretty small. And she was physically very close to both the Oval Office and to Mark Meadows' office. So she was basically the nerve center for what was going on in that White House. And as a result, she saw and heard, as well as participated in, much of what happened in the White House during her tenure there. And it seems clear from listening to her talk that people trusted her, perhaps trusted her. And again, this is not historical. This is me sort of observing as an older woman. Often older men don't necessarily interpret younger women as being independent actors. So they're kind of more comfortable talking to them than they might be with somebody who is more like them. That's just an observation that may or may not be correct. But as a result, a lot of people seem to have talked to her. And what she said today confirmed, I think, our worst fears about what was happening in the White House on before leading up to January 6th, and then also on January 6th itself. So let me just tell you what I remember off the top of my head. I did live tweet the hearings, but as I say, it's all a jumble to me right now because it was so shocking. So one of the things she made clear is that members of the White House understood that there was potential for violence as early as January 4th. That was the date that, off the top of my head, I remember her talking about. So they knew it could be violent. And even though they knew it could be violent, they continued to, the president continued to proceed along the lines he was proceeding, the idea that he had encouraged his supporters to fight, and not only Trump, of course. Rudy Giuliani did the same thing. Rudy Giuliani is one of Trump's lawyers, and then we get to so they knew that there was potential for violence, and then we got to what was the first absolute bombshell today, and that was, you have heard frequently from people on the right that there were no weapons on January 6th. And Hutchinson's, I didn't mean to call her by her first name. Hutchinson's, her first name is also a last name, obviously, and in my mind they just got confused. Hutchinson's testimony made it very clear that as early as 8 o'clock on the morning of January 6th, there was clear evidence coming in from law enforcement that there were people gathering near the Ellipse rally, which was where Trump and many of the people around Trump were going to be speaking, who were armed. And they were armed with everything from spears and flagpoles, as she talked about, but also with Glock-type handguns and with AR-15s, that is, with semi-automatic weapons. And that news came through the law enforcement officers to the White House, and she said that the president was made aware of that. So people in the White House knew that the people coming to the January 6th events of that day were armed. Now here's the shock. That's certainly shocking, but that's not the shocking part of this story. The shocking part of this story is that in order to get to hear the Ellipse, to be at the Ellipse where Trump was going to speak, they had to go through machines that we've all gone through, screening machines that would pick up whether or not we are carrying metal that could be used as a weapon. So this is the thing you go through when you go to a courthouse, for example, or a Red Sox game, as I'm sure you all do, or they're these machines that make sure that you're not armed. And apparently, according to her testimony, then President Trump was furious that these machines were keeping people out of the area in front of where he was going to speak, because he was adamant that he wanted the Ellipse to be chock full. Obviously, he's always cared about the optics. So he cared a lot about the optics of that. He wanted people to see a packed Ellipse. And he got very angry that the screeners were not just open, that people were actually getting stopped and their weapons were being taken off them. And that was slowing down the filling up of the Ellipse. And in fury, he yelled at, and I don't remember off the top of my head who it was he yelled at, but he yelled, and she overheard him more than once say, "They're not here to hurt me. Get rid of the effing machines." And they can go from the Capitol, from here to the Capitol. So that says a number of things. First of all, it says he knew they were armed and he knew they weren't there to hurt him, but it implies they were there to hurt somebody else and that he wanted them at the Capitol. That's huge right there. That he knew that there was something on its way to the Capitol. Then when his speech at the Ellipse was over, he apparently wanted to go to the Capitol And we haven't heard a lot about why. There was a little bit about that today, but he wanted to go to the Capitol, and he was so adamant that he was going to go to the Capitol that he pushed and pushed and pushed all day. Now, just let me get this out of the way. His chief of staff, Mark Meadows, wrote a book in which he said, oh, that was just rhetorical. And that was demolished today. It was not just rhetorical. That is, he was so determined to go there that there was that the Secret Service was actively working on whether or not they could manage to let him do that. Now, the White House counsel had repeatedly said that should not happen, that this put everybody who was involved in great legal jeopardy. They were very concerned about what he was planning to do on January 6th. And I'm going to say more about this in a minute, but it is mind-boggling that these people did not go to the cameras, to the Department of Justice, to any number of places to call out the fact they were afraid the president was about to try and launch a coup. And that right there says everything about who they are. And I'm sorry if you're hearing the disgust in my voice, but again, when you think of all the people in our past who have put their lives on the line for this democracy, to have those worms sitting there trying to keep this under wraps, it just makes my blood boil. Anyway, he was so determined to go to the Capitol that Cassidy made it clear there are two kinds of scheduling for the president. There's the official scheduling that everybody knows about, and then there's the off-the-record movement scheduling, which can be done very quickly. And they tried to put together an off-the-record movement scheduling for him to go over to the Capitol. And when that did not happen, when Mark Meadows was not able to make that happen, and they put him in the presidential limousine, which is known as the Beast, when they put him in the Beast and told him they were going to the White House and not to the Capitol, he got furious and said, I'm the effing president, take me to the Capitol. And when they still said, you can't do that, he actually tried to strangle. He tried to grab the wheel of the presidential limousine. And then when they grabbed his arm and said, you can't do that, he tried to strangle the driver. All right, let's just let that one sink in. So he was furious that he couldn't go there. Now let's think for just a second about what he was planning to do at that Capitol. The president cannot just walk into the Capitol building. That belongs to Congress. He can't do that. When the president gives a speech to the State of the Union, for example, he has to be invited by the Speaker of the House. And you may remember not that comes up frequently. You have to be invited. Sometimes there's a standing invitation, but usually there has to be a specific invitation for the president to breach that building, because that's Congress. He was just going to go. Okay, so what does that mean? We don't know. We may hear more about what he had in mind there, but he clearly expected to be part of an armed mob at the Capitol building. And that itself, as far as I'm concerned, we can stop right there, but we're not gonna. Okay, so the other thing that Cassidy talked about was that back in the White House, it was very clear to people like her and the White House legal counsel, Pat Cipollone and Eric Hirschman, who also worked in that building. Hirschman is the one who Cipollone has refused to testify, but Hirschman is the one that, if you're watching the hearings, he's the one always using the F word. They were just like, this has got to stop. And she kept trying to get Meadows' attention, and Meadows was just sitting in his office on his couch scrolling through his phone. And and every time she said the president has to say something, he would just say he doesn't want to do anything. He doesn't want to be involved. And interestingly enough, at one point, she and I'm not going to get this. I will write this up with my notes tonight. So this is coming, straight off the top of my head. So I'm not going to have all the things right at my fingertips. She said to him, you have to do something. Have you heard from Jim? And he sort of sat up and said, Jim. And she meant Jim Jordan, which fascinates me because I have been interested in what Jim Jordan was doing that day, since he went ballistic over the idea that he had talked to Trump in the morning. He didn't seem to care if anybody knew Trump talked to Trump in the afternoon, but the idea that he talked to Trump in the morning really upset him. If you remember that, you can Google this. He was really slippery about whether he'd not talked to Trump in the morning. And so I'm like, why? Like, what was about the morning? So apparently Meadows sat up and paid attention when she said, have you talked to Jim? And then at one point he has to go down and talk to Trump, and now I don't remember why. And he hands her his phone and says, "Let me know if Jim calls." And Jordan did call, and so she goes down and she hands him the phone. So Jordan's on the phone with him in the middle of all this, and I got to tell you, I want to know just how deep Jordan is involved in all this, because this is not passing the smell test. Anyway, so the other thing that came out then is that during the day, when it was clear that they were talking about, that the rioters were talking about hanging Mike Pence, that both Meadows and Trump were aware of that, and Trump refused to do anything about it. He said he deserves it. He didn't stand up for me, and he deserves this. So he condoned the physical danger of his vice president, which is, I mean, again, you don't have to like whichever president we get, but the system demands that we protect our lawmakers of any part. I mean, I don't need to explain that to you. So anyway, so he knew, and he was perfectly happy with them getting rid of Pence, and then he was under enormous pressure from his advisors and from his family to put out a video telling them all to go home, and the rioters all to go home. And this is important because it speaks to the idea that that he knew, that they all knew, that these were not random people, that these were rioters who were there for him, and he alone had the power to send them home, and he refused to do so. Okay, so that's out there as well. And a number of his advisors made it clear that they thought what he was doing put him in danger of having every law in the book, or there's some quote like that thrown at them, that this was what he was doing was a coup, was very much against the law. Okay, so he finally puts out a speech on video and had to be under great pressure to do so. And the speech he finally put out on January 7th, the next day, did not mention that the election was over. He refused to do that. He refused to talk about prosecutions for the rioters, and he wanted to tell them that he was going to pardon them. They would not let him say that. I don't know if they cut it or what. In that speech on the 7th, but it was very clear from Hutchinson's testimony that that the only reason he agreed to put out that speech was because by then a number of the cabinet members were talking about invoking the 25th Amendment, which says that which would have removed him from power, and they wanted to make sure they didn't do that. So that whole speech was only intended to undercut the attempt to get him out of there with the 25th Amendment. Okay, but we're not done. I mean, this hearing was unbelievable. The other piece of that is that Vice Chair Liz Cheney, who's a Republican from Wyoming, tied in Roger Stone and Roger Stone and Rudy Giuliani and Michael Flynn, that's the one. Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, the Proud Boys, and the Oath Keepers to this attempt to overturn the election. Now, as you know, the Oath Keepers and a number of the Oath Keepers and a number of the Proud Boys, who are right-wing militias, so-called militias, have pleaded guilty to conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. I'm sorry, to seditious conspiracy and to attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. So by tying Roger Stone and Michael Flynn to that, both of whom were pardoned by Trump and worked for Trump, they are tying this whole thing together in a much larger conspiracy. So that's the first mention we've heard of Roger Stone and Michael Flynn, who have insisted they were not involved, and yet, like their fingerprints are all over this event. So they tied those in, and then they ended. I think ended. I'll have to see if there's other stuff I remember. They ended um, uh, with the reality that a number of witnesses have told the committee that they have been threatened by the Trump people, to keep quiet. We know if you're loyal or not. If you're loyal, we'll take care of you, in language very reminiscent of mob bosses, which is really interesting in this moment for two reasons. First of all, because there are mob related laws that can go after conspiracies, which in this point I actually threw this out on Twitter and said, is that what they're doing here? And lawyers who actually handle RICO cases say there's no need. They got much clearer material here than RICO's real hard to prove, so they've got seditious conspiracy in spades at this point. So it was interesting for that, but it was also interesting for, I guess, two other reasons. One is because um, uh, mob threats only work if you have power. So what this speaks to is the belief of those people testifying that Trump is going to continue to have power to protect them, which is interesting to me because he doesn't protect anybody. I mean, the fact that the other thing that came out today was that both Mark Meadows and Rudy Giuliani asked him for pardons, asked him for presidential pardons, and he didn't give them. What's he got to offer now? The man doesn't have any money. He's a total grifter, and he doesn't have power. So they're making the calculation that he's going to get back into power and be able to pardon them and be willing to pardon them, which by the way, he doesn't appear to do. One of the reasons he may not want to pardon them is once you have, people think pardoning is an admission of guilt. It isn't necessarily. But what it does do is it takes you away your ability to argue the fifth because you can no longer self-incriminate. So once a president has given someone a pardon, they have to cough up the goods. And so it would hurt him to go ahead and pardon these people. So they're making a guess that he will pardon them, but I don't see why they would think that. So that's in a way a referendum on whether or not he still holds any power. And one more thing about the idea of witness tampering is that, first of all, it's crime, but second of all, what that did today was at the end of the hearings, Chair Benny Thompson said to people, we know that you have been encouraged to keep your mouths shut, but now would be a very good time, and I paraphrase, this is not a direct quote, now would be a very good time for you to adjust your testimony. Because what they were doing today, I think, in addition to giving us this bombshell testimony I'll talk more about in a second, what they were doing was saying to witnesses, we have the receipts. So now is your moment. And they're putting pressure, especially on people like Pat Cipollone, who was portrayed very positively today in the sense that he kept saying to Trump, don't do this, you're in trouble. He kept talking to Ms. Hutchinson saying, we got to stop this from happening. And they're essentially saying, now's the time for you to reevaluate whether or not you're better off staying on the Trump side, where they're making a lot of threats, but now that you know how much we've got from Hutchinson, do you really still think this is a good bet? Because we totally have the receipts. So it's going to be interesting to see how much more information comes out. I will also say the other thing about the witness tampering is there's a lot of speculation about why they came out with this today when they said they weren't going to have a hearing at least into July. Partly it was probably because Hutchinson is under a security threat, but it's also partly because if you were anyway involved in this and you heard her testimony today, just so what I've told you now, I would be beating a pathway to the Department of Justice. Now, there's another piece to this as well, and that is that the picture of Donald Trump that Hutchinson painted today was one of a man who was mentally unhinged. And not just mentally unhinged, because he has a long history of temper tantrums, let's call them, but they're not temper tantrums when they're a grown, large man. They're a temper tantrum when you're two. And he has there's a long history behind that of his first wife accusing him of domestic assault and long stories from his childhood. But she described a man who would throw his lunch across the room and throw plates at the walls and tear all the dishes off the table when he got angry. And they're drawing a picture of a child who is unstable and who has been covered his whole life by other people. And and if you know anything about personalities, you know that that's an incredibly unstable place to put any kind of faith. So partly, I think what they were doing was saying, "Now's your time, folks. We have this material. The time's a ticking. You better get your little hiney over there." And testify for us, and perhaps go to the Department of Justice, because if you have notes, if you have more information about this, now would be a very good time to spill it. All right, um, so a couple more things here about the hearing today. The first is that people have asked. I have to say, I'm really quite shocked, and I think I'm shocked not because I'm surprised at all, but because of, like I say, it's just such a huge picture. People have asked if this is like the Watergate tapes, like Alexander Butterfield saying that the tapes existed, or like Rosemary Woods testifying about what was on some of the tapes. This is way bigger. This is way bigger. If you remember Watergate, which is 50 years ago, what Watergate was about was the bugging of the Democratic National Committee, which was illegal. People went to jail for that. But then it was about the president being involved in covering that up. And Nixon was involved in that because he was concerned that there was material that would come out probably about his behavior in Vietnam. And we now know, and this is actually sort of interesting, we now know that in 1968 he sabotaged American and South Vietnamese attempts to settle that war in hopes that he would get elected from that. And I always thought that was a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory. And when the new news came out, probably about 5 or 10 years ago, I went to a colleague who does the Vietnam War. I don't think I should say his name, but he's very famous, just because sometimes people get attention they don't want after I mention their names. But it's very famous. You can Google this. And said, "Is that really true?" And he's like, "Oh, yeah, totally true. We now have the documents." So he was worried that people were going to find out that I think that he had, people were going to find out that he had scuttled those peace talks, and under those circumstances, that was against the law, and he would have gone to jail. So Nixon we didn't know that at the time, of course. That came out, 45 years later. So Nixon was concerned about covering up a burglary. We didn't understand the bigger picture at the time. This is a coup against the United States. This is a coup against you and me. And what Hutchinson uncovered today was then President Trump's participation in a coup against the United States, and his encouragement of armed supporters to march on our Capitol and overturn an election. And I don't really have words for that. So is this like Watergate? No, this is Watergate times 1,000, times 1,000,000. This is it. This is the biggest crisis in our history. And I say that including the Civil War. I'm a Civil War historian, because when people wanted to overturn the election of 1860, they left the country. Not all of them. The Congress had to expel a number of Congress people. I think it was either 11 or 17. But for the most part, they said, we don't want the people you elected, so we're going to go make our own country. They didn't say, we don't want the people you've elected, so we're going to overturn the entire system. That's where we are today. And I am having a really hard time wrapping my head around it. I'm not done. Because, of course, this is what happened today. But on Friday, the Supreme Court handed down the Dobbs decision, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, which overturned Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade had been law in America for 49 years. It recognized a constitutional right to abortion. And that is important because of the right to abortion and what that says. And I'm not going to talk about that today, because what the Supreme Court did with Dobbs is an uprooting of settled law. And that's important because theoretically, what the Supreme Court is supposed to do is try not to rock the boat. Now, sometimes it has to. And when it does have to rock the boat, as it did, for example, with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, the president gets out there, people get out there, they try really hard to say to Americans, hey, we got a problem, we're going to fix this problem here, but it's really going to mess stuff up. So in order to help that, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. No, this Supreme Court just said, yeah, we know you all like this. We don't care. We're going to change it. We're going to rip up settled law and we're going to write our own law that is based in Christianity. Even though our country theoretically is not based in Christianity, it's based in the rule of law. We don't care about the rule of law. We're going to tear that up. The day before that, they went after the idea of gun regulation. There has been in the last week just a complete reordering of the America's political system. And in addition to that, as you know, if you read me, that Clarence Thomas, who's been silent for the last, I don't know how many years, has been saying that he wants to take on a number of issues that are currently settled law in America, maintaining the separation between church and state, and to tear them apart. And Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is a scholar of authoritarianism, makes it very clear that this is a sign that he is at a place where he's trying to protect Ginny Thomas, who was involved in the insurrection, but also to say, I don't care what anybody thinks anymore. I'm going to do it my way. So maybe that's one of the reasons I'm sort of gobsmacked, is because we are seeing in this, it's not even been a week, and I'm using the word fruition not to mean we're done yet, but to say, here it is. People like me have been saying for years now, we are looking at a coup against American established democracy, what we have had since the signing of the Constitution. And we're seeing it play out. And one of the things that I find, I think, most shattering is it's being overturned by such small people. That is, it'd be one thing if we had some great hero come and say, I can fix everything, the way fascists at least promised to. This is a man who threw his lunch against the wall. Like, did your children even do that? You always hear children do that. I don't think my children ever threw food or anything against the wall. The fact that they were willing to back this sort of petty little somebody that if they were in your fifth grade classroom, you would hope that they sat in the far corner simply to get power, is such a sad commentary on the grandeur of what the concept of self-determination is all about, that I am personally offended by that. And I'm going to transition now into what I really wanted to talk about today before I knew there was going to be this hearing. And that is where we are in this moment in America and what we can do about it. Because as you know, I'm a historian and I tend not to want to say, go do stuff, because that's not really my personal role, I think, in America today. But then it hit me as I was flying up here. I do know what has worked in the past, and I have ideas about that. And I'm in Washington because I was at a meeting last night about democracy, and there were some really smart people there, one of whom is the author of a book called How Democracies Die, a great book, and a co-author, I'm sorry, there were two of them. And he made a really important point. When one of the people who was there talked about the rise of dictatorships around the world right now and how people, sort of generic people, were backing strongmen, he said you need to stop right there, because the people never back a dictator. Dictators do not rise from majority backing. Dictators rise when a very few, a small minority of people get behind an individual because they're mediocre and they want power. And the majority is so divided and so unlikely to take that crazy dictator seriously that they don't organize to push back against that small faction. And so, for example, that's how Hitler took power. That's how, you go through the whole list. They do not have a majority. They have a minority, and the majority cannot get their acts together to push back against them. So I would urge you, first of all, to remember that these are small people, and they are people who do not command a majority. We are the majority. That doesn't mean we agree on politics at all. In fact, I'm always amused. People make a lot of assumptions about what my politics are, and I keep saying I'm a historian. It's a real mistake to map me onto the present. I suspect that as a friend of mine once said, everybody should march on Washington at some point in their life, because it's the only time in your life you'll be with 500,000 other people with whom you disagree about everything except the one issue you're there for. This is that moment for us. The one issue that we need to agree on is the concept of democracy, the rule of law, and the idea of self-determination. Once we can reestablish democracy in America, then we can fight about funding for the military or funding for schools or any of the things that we would fight about. But that right now must take precedence. And on that front, we're a majority. I mean, again, who would have thought that Liz Cheney and I would have been on the same team? And yet I am very proud to stand behind her on that issue, not on the Dobbs issue, but on that issue. So first of all, remember that we are the majority. And I'm actually using that hashtag now on Twitter. We are the majority. And this is precisely what Abraham Lincoln did in 1854, 1855, 1856, when he started to pull people together around the idea of protecting American democracy. He keeps saying, those people who are trying to spread human enslavement around this nation are a minority, which we now know they were. They were very powerful. They had the Supreme Court, they had the presidency, and they had the Senate, but they were a minority. And it's really, really important to maintain that. Now, that's great. That's the first principle. But, and you know that I care about the way we talk about things. That's what I study. I'm listening to all these people talk last night about democracy and what the problems are and all that. And every single thing that somebody said, I heard the radical minority has taken over this country because they have dominated our public discussions. And they have done so in part through Fox News, but also in part through social media and the algorithms on social media that elevate the wrong sorts of speech. And to me, that's the way to push back. We have a problem with the fact algorithms on social media elevate people who make you angry rather than people who give you facts. But I want to suggest some ways to push back on that. First of all, one of the things somebody pointed out to me the other day, one of my regular readers, is that local media is dying, and a lot of people don't know what's happening at their school boards and at their town planning meetings, and at the argument about whether or not to put in a new causeway to the hospital or whatever, because our local newspapers are dying for many reasons that I won't go into. Newspapers are just your neighbors taking a look at what's happening around them. And I would urge you to go to the town meetings and write up what happened there. You don't need a publisher. You don't need any of those things. You can publish it on Facebook. You can publish it on Substack, both of which are free. There are probably other places as well. But make sure your neighbors are informed about who is doing what. The other thing that I would urge people to do is always, always, always ask for sources from me as well as from everybody else. And you don't have to be like mean about it, like, you're an asshole, well, where are you getting that information? But when somebody says that the attack on January 6th was Antifa, what is your source for that? Now, people who are firmly in the tank for the crazies are not going to ever answer. They're just going to get defensive. But they're lost anyway. Who we're looking for is the same way Lincoln did. We're looking for those people who don't think it matters to them, who aren't paying attention. I really believe that people gravitate toward facts. And if we can say, well, no, actually, that's not what happened. Or no, actually, you're reading this wrong. And we all make mistakes, by the way. I retweeted something the other night that I misinterpreted. And someone said, that's not what happened. And provided a source that said, no, Richardson, you're wrong. I apologized. I erased everything I had done. That's how you clean up the public discourse. Put pressure on media, not to both sides this, not to say, for example, there is um, confusion over this issue when one side is lying and the other side is telling the truth. Put pressure on our media, on our politicians to be honest, to actually step up to the plate and be honest and that about what's happening. And that, there's a lot of you out there who can do those things. So the reclaiming of our public discourse to me is incredibly important, incredibly important. And it's something that you can do even if you don't want to write about the school board or anything like that. You can do it on social media. You can do it with your neighbor. And again, I think a lot of us are not confrontational, and you don't want to say to your neighbor, you're an idiot, but you can say, that's not what I saw. Where did you learn that? And work toward a place where people are sharing facts as opposed to the craziness that they're now getting from right-wing media. You're not going to get everybody, but I will tell you, this is exactly how the right wing got started. People took off. People started to talk to their neighbors, talk to their friends, started to get together and have coffee clatches, they called them when it was the John Birch Society, to spread false information. There is absolutely no reason that people who are rooting their understanding of our country in real information can't do the same thing. Have, with your running groups, if you're a runner, or your gardening groups or whatever, make sure we are all on the same page in terms of facts. That's how you build a movement. One person reaching out to another. Your voice is way more important than my voice with your friends or anybody else's voices. We listen to our friends. So if our friends talk about crazy stuff, we start to believe that crazy stuff. If our friends talk about reality, that's what we listen to. That's one thing every single person can do, is reach out to neighbors and reach out to friends. Now, there's another piece of this that jumps out to me in the wake of the Dobbs decision, and that's the number of people who are offering now to participate in new ways in the fight for women's rights. And it's not just women's rights, it's everybody's rights in this country. And on that front, here's a big piece. I would urge you, of course, to reach out to people, of course, to try to do new things, but to remember that there are long-standing organizations in this country that have been fighting the good fight for a very long time. And to reach out to them and to not to try and reinvent the wheel. So, for example, one of the things that has really jumped out to me while I've been writing this last book is that especially in the 1970s, we started to emphasize in the civil rights movement, for example, the roles of individuals, like, for example, Rosa Parks, or like Emmett Till and Emmett Till's mother. And they certainly were presented as, at least in the textbooks I read, as individuals who sort of came down from the mountains and started saying really smart things. And they are certainly great individuals who said really smart things, but almost all of those figures that you recognize now as being major figures in the change in the civil rights movement were affiliated with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which began working in 1909, 100th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, to guarantee that Black Americans had the same rights as white Americans. And that pressure from the NAACP is what made sure that newspapers took a look at, for example, the gang rape of Mrs. Taylor that got, in 1947, that got Rosa Parks really into prominence in the NAACP. That was 47. Rosa Parks, of course, is going to become much famous with not going to the back of the bus and starting the Montgomery bus boycott. But it was the NAACP that kept calling reporters, kept saying, hey, did you see what happened? That kept calling attention to atrocities and to instances in which there might be a legal case. And that push of institutions, the NAACP, Planned Parenthood, I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I'm not going to be able to give you a whole bunch of them. Other people probably can in the chat. But that is a really good way to multiply your voice and to make sure that we're not all sort of pulling opposite each other. Because one of the things I think we lost in the 1970s, those of us who cared about the liberal consensus and the fairness of equality before the law, is we started to think that everybody could do it individually, and we lost the sight of being able to put a lot of muscle behind individual groups, or groups that were actually already tugging at that rope and moving that rope forward. So absolutely put your muscle into individual things you want to do, but please don't ignore the fact that you don't really need to reinvent the wheel. And sometimes reinventing the wheel is actually more harmful because you're gumming up the works for people who already know what they're doing. So be aware of that as well. Somebody just mentioned red, wine, and blue here. That's a great example of people who are pulling together the country in Ohio to try and move the ball forward, and they're doing a really great job. And again, really focus on the local as well as the state and as well as the national. All right, I think the League of Women Voters is another thing that is another one to mention here. Somebody I just saw put in the chat that a lot of people don't want to hear what you have to say. I want to be really clear on that one. The dyed-in-the-wool Trumpers, you are never going to reach. You're just never going to reach them. They're gone. But I really believe that the way conversations change, public conversations, national conversations change, is by having a lot of voices out there that shift the needle in a general way. So, I'm not suggesting you have to go knock on the door of your Trumper neighbor. I actually just cut ties to someone the other day who took one look at me and said, you're a nice lady, but you're crazy. And I was like, I don't really need that in my life. We've been at this now for years. I didn't approach him saying that. He approached me saying that. And I thought, you know what? Then he doesn't deserve to have my company. I'm done. I'm not gonna. I love his wife, but I'm done. We're not talking any longer. But a lot of people haven't staked out a position. So those are the people that are still reachable, and to bring this full circle. And also convincing to vote, as somebody said, to bring this full circle, that hearing today was a really big deal. And one of the ways you can tell it was a big deal was because the Fox News channel carried it live, which it has not done before, which suggests that needle is changing. And after it was over, and I retweeted this, and now I can't for the life of me think of who tweeted it in the first place. When it was over, 3 hosts just sat there silent. They were like, they just had nothing to say. And believe me, there's no such thing as dead TV airtime. TV time is very expensive and you fill every minute. And they just sat there because they knew that they had heard something that was unprecedented. So we're at a moment now when it feels like the needle has the potential to change. I'm not going to promise you the sun, the moon, and the stars here, but it's all up in the air. And for me, it's all up in the air, and we've looked for one backstop after another to save our democracy. And at the end of the day, who the backstop is? It's us. And I'm really tired of sort of waiting for somebody to do something. And now I think it's time for us to recognize that it is literally up to us. And with the fury over the Dobbs decision, and now this explosive testimony today, if you're not mad, you're not paying attention, as they say. So for me, I feel like we're in a new place. And I have to say to you, what is really weird about this is that, having just sat in that chair over there, shell-shocked for an hour after those hearings, I think for the first time in a long time, I feel creative again. Like they just burned it all down. Like my whole life, I've been trying to fight a holding action against the burning down of our government. and I just watched the Republicans under Trump burn it all down. So if we're ever going to rebuild it, now's the time. And that's the first time in my life I actually had a glimpse of what it might be like to rebuild in a creative, inclusive way. So for all that this is gobsmacking, it also feels like it might be a particularly and it's not getting better today. We're on the downhill right now, but it also feels like this might be a time when we can actually take advantage of our creativity and our decent people's willingness to rebuild the concept of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. All right, I don't really have much more than that. I'm sorry I didn't ask for questions. I'm sure there's more you want to know about. And someone just said Trump is on Truth Social and he's terrified. I'm not surprised he's terrified. Every lawyer that I have read on Twitter in the last hour said that the coffin just got nailed shut. That was it. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but as a historian, I'm looking at that and thinking, I can't put my head around it. Believe me, I actually planned an entire course once on political scandals. So I know political scandals, and this is unimaginable. I just can't even. I mean, this is like nuclear grade as opposed to anything we have seen before. So so I think all bets are off. But that's also a very important time to think about what we really do care about. And I always come back to the idea that I've talked about in those history chats, that when Thomas Paine first talked about what it meant to have a government, he talked about how governments were instituted among men to create stability, and we had the right to consent to them. And that's, of course, what the Declaration of Independence picked up, the idea that we have the right to consent to our government and that we are all equal, so that the laws under which we live should treat us all equally. And, you know, one of the complaints that people have gotten or have talked about when they talked about how the right wing has picked up so many followers is that with the breakdown of the guidelines that gender and race lines provided for Americans until the 1970s, even, you know, it was easy for people who were concerned about freedom, their own particularly, that is psychologically, to recognize there were guidelines. But when the Supreme Court started to say, no, your guidelines are not going to be race and gender anymore, they felt the need to impose some other kind of guidelines. And a lot of those people jumped to a really strict form of Christianity. We can provide guidelines in a society without relying on race or gender or religion. Our guidelines can be those of fairness, in which we say that the rich people shouldn't get to take everything. They can be guidelines of the idea that the law stands as a guideline for all of us and we're all equal before the law. They can be guidelines that say that we all should have equal access to resources, including education. These are all guidelines we have incorporated in the past, although we've never fully brought them to fruition. We could do that going forward, and now it feels like is the time. All right, I've got a splitting headache, and I need to take a break. I'm going to go for a walk, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to walk down to the Lincoln Memorial and give him my regards, as I always do when I come to Washington. So here we go, folks. It's going to be quite a ride over the course of this summer, but I guess we just got to have faith that we can make the concept of self-government really work, maybe for the first time. Thanks for being here.